resources, is able to successfully challenge established incumbent businesses. And a popular way to think about this is to think of an underdog, or for just to give an example, a David and Goliath situation. If you recall the story of David and Goliath, if you've ever heard it, you have on one end Goliath, who's this behemoth, this biggest, toughest, strongest warrior anyone has ever seen. And on the other end, you have David, a simple shepherd boy. And in most cases, you would reasonably expect that the bigger warrior would win. Well, that's not the way that this story played out. And that's not the way that business always works out either. In fact, frequently the smaller business with the newer, more innovative idea for a product or service ends up being the winner, despite the fact that they have maybe a lack of resources. The idea the smaller company brings to the table may just be a better idea than what currently exists in the marketplace. Now, keep in mind, this is a process. It involves resources and it has to successfully challenge or change the status quo. And the status quo is essentially how we've always done things. Disruption and change can be viewed as the same thing. You're probably more familiar with this concept than you realize. For example, many of us drive cars. I successfully drove to Green Bay in the snow and icy roads. And at one point in history, nobody had a car. Everything was done either on foot or on horseback. And that transition wasn't as simple as coming up with an idea for the internal combustion engine, although that is how it started. It started with one idea. I wanted to call it a simple idea, but I don't think a combustion engine is a simple idea. It took many different people trying and failing and a lot of resources, but eventually the change happened in a way that automobiles became the primary mode of transportation. So that's one version of sort of disruption or change that we're all very, very familiar with. A lot of disruption can be ongoing. Things like streaming entertainment versus traditional cable services, for example. Streaming has not made cable go away necessarily, but it has certainly caused a massive shift in the way we receive our entertainment, and it's completely upset the market share. And that's in a business context, but what do we mean more specifically for sterile processing? Disruption actually impacts the current ways that we do our job and the current products and solutions we may be using to do our job. And those of you who have been in the industry for decades have probably seen massive amounts of change. The way we did things 20 years ago is not the way we do things now. And probably the way we do things now, think about it, the way we do things now isn't going to be the way we do things years down the road. And that's the beauty and sort of the mystery of change and disruption. Here's an example for you. The very first laparoscopic cholecystectomy, or the laparoscopic gallbladder removal, wasn't performed until 1985. And at that point, it was just experimental. I was born in 1985, and I don't feel like that was all that long ago. But now it's completely changed the way that we do surgery. It's introduced a wide array of new instrumentation, new cleaning challenges, and a number of further advances that are all based on this concept of minimally invasive surgery. So prior to that, the only way to take someone's gallbladder was with an open procedure. All the instrumentation that we had was for open procedures. And now we have this minimally invasive laparoscopic instrument set, and we have robotic instruments, and who knows what's going to come in the next 5 to 10 years to assist with these types of procedures and make them even less invasive and even a quicker turnaround. That's why it's so important for us to not only seek out, but really understand disruption and understand how to adapt to that change, because that change can lead to some really cool innovations and changes in the way that we actually do our jobs. First, let's consider the idea of industry disruption. We're going to take a look at industry disruption from multiple perspectives. And the first perspective that we're going to look at it from is the manufacturer's perspective. There's an idea or an innovation, and we tend to think about a good idea as being all that it takes to make a big difference. But in reality, there's a lot that has to happen in order to make that idea or that innovation a real life product or service. And honestly, most ideas remain just that. They remain ideas until someone has the resources and the capability to bring that idea to the next level. The first step that has to happen is we have to research. We have to develop the specific features and functions of the idea or the innovation. And again, think of this as from a manufacturer's perspective. So if you were a company and you were an inventor trying to come up with the next big product that's going to change the game for sterile processing, obviously some research and development is going to have to come with that process. Then we have to go through the patent protection process so that we can protect and preserve that idea is going to remain our own. We then have to move into validation and regulatory submissions if it's required. And there are often trials and beta testing because that's what makes sense. What makes sense, and the outcomes that come about in a lab won't likely be the same outcomes that mirror what happens in the field. So that info has to make it back to the engineers so they can make the innovation more practical. There is often some market research to find out how receptive people are going to be to this new idea and to this new change in process. And branding also makes a really big difference when you have this innovation that's going to kind of disrupt the market. After all that, you have your big go-to market push, and that's still not the end because there still has to be a significant amount of education and user support in order to continue growing that product or service to your customers. An important detail that often gets missed is that a business doesn't start making money. So think of the last product that you brought into your department. The business that sells that product doesn't start making money on that specific idea until it gets to the go-to-market step, until it actually hits the sterile processing field. All those steps that I just mentioned, from idea and innovation down to branding, all of those steps have to come before that. And that is just cost that company is actually just eating. They won't start getting paid until the product's on the market. So the investment of time and money and resources is huge before that part even comes to fruition. I don't know if any of you are podcast people. Beyond Clean happens to have a podcast that might interest you, but there's another podcast that I really like to tune into. It's called How I Built This. And it basically goes through stories of people who've developed businesses and products. Often they're very wealthy by the time they're telling their story. But what you learn is how many of them were up to their eyeballs in debt, bankrupt multiple times until their big idea finally made it to market and they started making money. Because again, all those steps that the manufacturer has to go through before even bringing their product to market takes time and money. So the risk of a disruptive idea or innovation is extremely high for businesses. And if you're wondering to yourself, wow, why haven't more manufacturers come up with this way to improve how we do things, or come up with this new product to make this process more streamlined or more simple? It's because those disruptive ideas and that innovation comes with a significant amount of risk, especially in healthcare when we're talking more about the risk to people's lives. So we'll talk more about risks in a minute. But from a manufacturer's perspective, that's kind of what the process of industry disruption looks like. Now, let's consider the idea of industry disruption from the sterile processing perspective. This is the perspective that I love to look at things through because sterile processing is near and dear to my heart. Something I failed to mention at the beginning is that I also am a sterile processing technician, and I have my CRCST and my CFER through CBSPD. So when I think about disruption from a sterile processing tech's perspective, basically any change to a product or a process that happens in our area affects how we do our job on a daily basis. So the idea of being open to change is kind of an interesting one because it's easier said than done. So when we consider the idea of industry disruption from the SPD perspective, first we need to become aware of a problem, okay, or of a product that solves a current pain point. And we're like, aha, okay, that would be the perfect solution to this problem. And this is why I'm going to bring this up a lot during the next 45 minutes or so. This is why continuing education and networking are so important for growth in sterile processing. Because it's often said that you don't know what you don't know. Sometimes we have pain points in sterile processing or frustrations in our department over a process or over a product, and we just don't know that there's a solution that exists unless we network and unless we encourage ourselves and constantly educate ourselves on what's new in the industry. So if you don't know what you don't know, how are you to know that something is a problem with a possible solution unless you're interacting with other professionals in this field? And with new education that can draw your attention, um, and increase your ability to identify and deal with problems and solutions. That's why I love, and so an interesting part about 2020 is it's forced all of our in-person gatherings to happen virtually. And kudos to all of you for spending your Saturday engaging in this discussion, because what that says to me and what that should say to you and to your colleagues and to your department leaders is that you're investing in learning something new and finding out if there's a better way to potentially approach a problem or a solution to a common problem. As a sterile processing tech, you need to know what's going on in the market. What products are being developed that could potentially help you do your job in a more efficient or more effective way? Then, of course, you have to do your own element of research and evaluation of a product as a department to adequately determine whether or not it's the right solution. And this process highlights the need and the importance of cross-functional teams. You can get everybody's input who will be affected by a significant change in products. You have to determine what really will be the best fit if it's going to affect more than just your department. So those cross-functional teams come in really critically to ensuring that research phase is carried out appropriately. Doing this often requires a broader understanding of sterile processing workflow and how it affects the end user, which is us, the sterile processing technicians. And it's common for sterile processing leadership to know that much of the process of adopting a new practice or purchasing a new product involves educating other decision makers on why they need that product in the first place. So if you're a sterile processing leader and you're tuned into this presentation right now, and you've ever had to essentially pitch a new product to administration or to whoever's writing the check for your department, you essentially have to become a salesperson, not only for that new product, but also for your department. And you have to educate those other decision makers on what it is you do, why this new process or product is critical for your ability to carry out the department functions. We have to decide which product and process to adopt, which one fits the best, and keep in mind that frequently the person who does have that final decision-making authority may not have any idea what sterile processing does. It could be a supply chain VP or a chief operating officer. They may not know about the specific workflow in sterile processing, but it's up to sterile processing leadership to go and convince them that this particular solution is necessary. And like I said, it almost requires the sterile processing leadership to become internal salespeople for that new product. Not part of your job description by any means, but once again, once we make that decision, it's going to require a change for those end users as well. So not only are you being a salesperson for the people writing the checks, but you're also becoming a salesperson for everyone who's going to adopt that change. So all the end users like us sterile processing technicians, we also need to be convinced that whatever change is going to happen, especially if it's a big disruptive change, that it makes sense to us why it's happening so we can properly adopt it as a department. This could be one of the most challenging areas for sterile processing leaders trying to enact change for frontline users. Typically speaking, the more dramatic the change, the more dramatic the pushback will be. Change is really hard. I mentioned this at the beginning. Change is hard for everybody. So if it's a monumental change and it's going to shift a big part of what I do as a sterile processing technician, potentially my pushback is also going to be pretty significant. And this puts you sterile processing leaders in a place of, again, being that internal salesperson. First, you had to convince the decision maker to adopt the new process or product. And now you have to convince your staff to adopt the new process or product. And that's a really heavy, loaded process both ways. Finding ways to persuade different behavior or encourage a new way of thinking are critical in sterile processing. And one thing to consider is when you're influencing a shift in behavior or a shift in thinking, especially when it comes to disruption or change in products or processes, something to keep in mind is asking for less can actually get you more. And let me explain what I mean. As a human being, and think of it, you deal in the currency of human beings. We're all humans. We all bring our own stuff to every situation. But as humans, we develop a certain set of internal markers for what seems possible, what seems feasible. And especially in the workplace, when we're used to something happening a certain way, we set up those systems and those markers saying, okay, this is what's possible here, and this is what I'm used to, and this is what works. If the shift that you as a leader are asking for is too far outside that window of what I as a sterile processing tech think is feasible, it will automatically get ignored. And that's just human nature. So when you're looking to make a giant request or influence a shift in behavior or attitude, try breaking your request into bite-sized pieces that will eventually lead to that big change or that shift in behavior. Bite-sized changes are more easily adopted, and eventually they'll stack up and they'll add up to lead to that big change or that big shift. So if you're a sterile processing leader wondering how you're going to implement this giant change in either product, process, or behavior or attitude, try the baby steps to get to that big shift. And sterile processing techs, if you're the one who's trying to be influenced to change, think of it as no one's going to want laparoscopic surgery to go back to full open surgery, right? We've got new products, we've got new processes, new innovations that have made it easier for not only the patient, but also everyone who works in the hospital. Going backwards isn't interesting to anybody. So those small changes, those small shifts can lead to bigger change that will lead to better processes and a way to do your job more efficiently, effectively, and hopefully with more peace of mind. For a new product or process to become the new normal, it's going to require a lot of experience with the new product or process by frontline technicians, and it will frequently require policy and procedure updates. So there has to be this feedback loop to make sure that everything is flowing smoothly. If there's no feedback loop, that could lead to frontline technicians getting frustrated, feeling like their opinions don't matter, and it can even hinder the new product or process itself and cause it to be a failed implementation. And that's not interesting to anybody either. Another key point of feedback, don't forget to offer feedback to the original decision maker. So remember, that VP of supply chain or the chief operating officer that you had to advocate the change to get the final approval. It's important to take those successes that you've achieved, report them back to the decision makers so they can see how that change positively affected the functionality of your hospital and, on a micro level, your department. And again, that decision maker may not be familiar with the day-to-day function of your department, so it's really helpful to package up those successes in terms that they identify with. So generally speaking, the most effective method to do this is with objective key performance indicators. So those numbers that really tell us how well is this new thing working. And this could be a productivity number, like the time required to turn over a single set, or the cost of turning over a single instrument set. Whatever that number is, document the success and report that back to that decision maker so they know that the decision that they made was the right decision. And when you close that specific piece of the feedback loop, it's going to increase the probability that the next time you bring a new product or a new process to them, they're going to be more likely to say yes, because they know the last time they said yes, it led to something truly positive. So just something to consider as a department leader when you're closing those feedback loops. It's important to take the feedback from the frontline users, and it's important to package up feedback and the success story of an implementation and share that information with the final decision maker. Another important angle that we have to look at the concept of industry disruption from is the regulatory and accreditation perspective. So we've looked at industry disruption from a manufacturer's perspective. We've looked at it from the sterile processing department's perspective, but there's this whole other perspective that's really important to consider. When disruption in this industry particularly happens, everyone from the regulatory and accreditation side has to first become aware of a new process or product, and will have to do their own research and evaluation. And they depend on feedback from you in the field and from their surveyors to get that feedback so they can do their evaluation and research appropriately. Regulatory and accreditation organizations aren't just there evaluating what you're specifically doing, but they're also reporting back to their central offices to evaluate new things that they're hearing and new things that they're seeing in the field. And oftentimes these organizations will make use of work groups, which are specialized and focused groups around a specific process or problem. I'm sure everyone has heard of AMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. AMI makes very frequent and regular use of these specialized work groups. And in fact, all of their technical information reports or TIR reports, all of their ST standards like ST79, ST91, all of those started with work groups, and they continue to work on those reports and standards in the context of one of these work groups. So they'll often read through white papers and case studies, and only after they've gone through this rigorous process will you see a new standard come out. This also requires collaborative conversation with the users and the industry representatives. So something that I want to encourage all of you to do is, if you've ever wondered what it's like to sit in one of those roundtable meetings with the folks who write ST79, you can be a part of that group. And they actually encourage users to become a part of that group so that the user perspective is just as represented as the manufacturer's perspective. So if you've ever thought to yourself, that might be kind of interesting, or I'd like to give it a try, reach out to AMI and let them know that you're interested in joining a working group, because I know that they'd be interested in having you as an end user a part of that. It's really easy to overlook the fact that collaborative conversation implies that there are already users using a new process or product that has not been written into the standards yet. So think about this for a second. That means that standards that are written are typically very reactive. They're reacting to something that has already been on the market. For example, we're seeing more and more that borescopes used for internal inspection of lumens are actually being written into the standards, but borescopes didn't come on the market at the same time that the standards were written about them, or those recommendations were written about them. Borescopes had existed for quite some time, and the standards and the accreditation bodies sort of had to catch up. So standards are typically very reactive. They're reacting to something that's already been made use of on the market. And therefore, it's really unusual. It's not impossible, but it's certainly unusual that the standards lead the way to industry disruption or industry change. Typically, the standards are adjusted after the disruption has already started taking place. And I think that's fascinating, because as a sterile processing tech, I look at ST79 and it's essentially my working, my job workbook, my Bible, if you will. That's what I follow. But I have to keep in mind that there are products on the market and processes on the market that aren't specifically mentioned in the standards yet, because they're so disruptive that the standards haven't caught up yet and understood the benefits of those products or understood the technology of those products. So I think that is just a fascinating interplay between innovation and the standards that we use. So everything forms a feedback loop, and I mentioned the feedback loop before when I was talking about the importance of sharing, of sterile processing leaders getting feedback from frontline users, and then also sharing feedback with the COO or the VP of supply chain, whoever makes the final purchasing decision if it's not you. Everything forms a feedback loop when it comes together, and this is the only way that disruption and change happens effectively. Manufacturers have to work with sterile processing users who have to work with regulatory bodies, and around we go. So the manufacturers are trying to get some end users to implement their new disruptive product. That new disruptive product takes hold, and it changes something for the better. And all of a sudden, those users have to communicate with the regulatory folks that, hey, this is something that can really impact the industry for the better. Let's look at how we can write it into standards, etc. So that feedback loop is just a constant, and that's really when the disruption process comes together and can really take form. I mentioned earlier that disruption requires a certain amount of resources. And let's take a look at the difference between the resources required by, for example, an established product or an established company versus the resources required by a disruptive or new product, new disruptive company. First, let's start with the technical and scientific resources. Typically, these are already in place when established companies, companies that have been around for quite some time, because they've already been through this process. But for a company that's new, a company that's disruptive, or a product that's brand new, much of this has to be completed and published first and foremost. Education is already in place for an established company or product, but the disruptive company, a brand new company with a brand new product, has to actually go through the process of creating education, creating product collateral. Marketing is already in place for an established product or company. But again, for that new disruptive product or company, marketing has to be created. They have to find distribution channels. They have to figure out what their target messaging is. I always say that if you have the best tagline on the planet for a pet grooming service, and the only people seeing your message are non-pet owners, you're going to have an issue with your product taking off or your business taking off. So developing your target message and really finding your niche in terms of who you want that message to actually resonate with and actually land on is an important part of building up those resources. The regulatory process that we mentioned earlier has already gone through its rigorous paces for an established company or an established product. But for a disruptive company or new company, the regulatory piece must still be approved. The standards have to eventually be updated if that's part of the requirements. So there's a lot more that has to happen on the front end in order for a disruptive product or company to actually to be a thing. And of course, an established company already has its market share. But for a disruptive company, they have to earn their way in, and they have to essentially break up that market share. So let's think of the instrument tray market. Okay, there are instrument trays on the market. There are manufacturers that have been around for a very long time and have a significant part of that market share. If someone new were to come in and bring a new product that fits in that category or in that market, they're going to have to take bits and pieces of that market share. And so it's an interesting battle from a manufacturer's perspective on resonating, having your messaging, your value proposition, your marketing resonate with your end users so that they don't lose any of the market share that they've obtained. I love the business side of our industry. I think it's just fascinating. So how do limited disruptive resources impact you as a sterile processing user and me as a sterile processing user? Limited disruptor resources can have a huge impact on us. First of all, that early product and technical information can be very limited, which can make it really difficult for us as users to adequately evaluate a new product or a process. If we don't have all the technical information, for example, if an instruction for use has vague information, or if there's not a lot of case studies or white papers or really any information about this new product that we're supposed to implement, it's going to be really hard for us to implement it and really adequately evaluate how it's affecting us. And think back to what I said earlier in that key decision maker conversation. That key decision maker may not be familiar with sterile processing workflow. So it's up to sterile processing leaders to advocate for a new product. And if you don't have all the information you need about that new product, it's going to be really hard for you to advocate for it. Without solid product information, it makes that advocacy almost impossible. So it impacts. If there's a lack of resources from a technical information standpoint, it's going to impact sterile processing users. And that's one way it's going to. There are often, I love this conversation so much. There are often misunderstandings and misconceptions in place. If a new company, for example, doesn't have a social media page or a web presence, that actually can add to those misunderstandings and misconceptions. We're finding that more and more decision makers in the sterile processing industry are connecting with product manufacturers through platforms like LinkedIn, for example. So for a new disruptive company or a new disruptive product, that lack of social media presence can be incredibly harmful for getting that product to actually take off in the marketplace. If you've ever been to a trade show or a seminar, you've seen those behemoth booths, right? The ones that you walk into the trade show floor and it's like all you see is this big giant globe hanging from the ceiling with a vendor name on it. When you walk that expo hall, those booths cost an exorbitant amount of money. So it's really difficult for disruptors, those small companies that are trying to just make their mark and take off in the industry. It's really difficult for them to make an impression on that scale because they don't have the monetary resources to invest in that sort of footprint in a trade show hall. There's also limited word of mouth testimonials. We know that word of mouth tends to be the most powerful marketing tool. But if a product or service is new and there are very few customers that are using it, very few early adopters, there's going to be less word of mouth testimonial opportunities. And think about the pressure on a disruptive company to make those early adopters or those users who take a chance and say, you know what, yes, I'm going to try out your new product. The pressure on that company to make those early adopters or those first users into believers and advocates of a disruptive product or company, that pressure is huge. Because if the first people using that new product don't believe in it, that word of mouth marketing is just never going to happen. Or it's going to happen to your detriment as a company. Disruptive products and companies often have little to no reference or perhaps confusing references to current industry guidelines. Think of, and I'm sure you can think to yourselves, products that you may use in your department right now where the standards are either confusing as it relates to that product, or that product just isn't even discussed. Like the way that product impacts your department is yet to be discussed in standards. So like we talked about earlier, the standards typically come after the disruption has already started to take place. So it may be difficult to convince decision makers to buy into an idea of a disruptive product if there's a lack of current standards in support of that product. The guidelines are often slow to catch up to innovation, and that's the tricky part of being a disruptive company is you just have to kind of rely on all the work that you've done to get the product to market sort of supporting and speaking for itself so that people trust in it. End users trust in your product, trust in your process, and then that trust then spreads, the word of mouth spreads, and then that technology is then more discussed from a regulatory standpoint. Fascinating to me. Now this can lead to a number of misconceptions, some important points on resource availability for disruptive technologies. I want to spend some time on this slide. I'm going to read it, but I want each one of these things to really sink in. And this may seem obvious in some sense, but anybody who's been through this process knows how frequently decisions are made or products or processes are rejected based on these assumptions. So look at that first line. Limited product or technical information does not mean that there's no information that exists, okay? Misunderstandings and misconceptions about a specific product doesn't necessarily mean that the science is not clear. Okay, so that's where the end user research comes in, like really doing your research about the science about a product, because if it's a new technology and there's science in support of it, but that technology goes almost against what you've been doing from a process perspective up until this point, there's going to be misunderstandings and misconceptions about it, hands down. But those misunderstandings and misconceptions doesn't mean that the science in support of it isn't clear. A lack of social media or web presence doesn't mean that a company isn't reputable. It may just mean that they don't have the resources yet to, put into those advertising opportunities and those platforms. Lack of presence at trade shows or seminars doesn't mean the product is not on the market. So I'm going to encourage all of you, if any of you are going to in-person trade shows this year, next year, in the next 5-10 years, whatever your timeline is for going to in-person trade shows, take some time with those smaller booths. Take some time with those industry disruptors who are, doing things in a different way. We're doing things in a disruptive way. And really find out if there's new technology that can really impact your department. environment. Also, I want to encourage you all, virtual vendor shows are a beautiful thing because it takes the pressure off you from having to walk by booths and be almost like surrounded by salespeople, right? Those, those in-person trade shows can get really overwhelming because you walk by a booth and you're like, okay, don't make eye contact, just keep walking, I have a destination. But with virtual expos, you have the opportunity to engage with companies and products on your own time. And I think that's a beautiful thing, and it allows you to really go in deep and find out information about new technology that exists and new ways of doing things that maybe you haven't thought of before. Limited word of mouth testimonials doesn't mean that no other hospitals are using it. It may just mean that you haven't spoken yet with a hospital that is using it. And lack of reference in industry guidelines does not mean that that new product is not in line with best practice. So these are really important things to keep in mind when it comes to simple resources. For those disruptive technologies. Sometimes resources just aren't available yet. So by this point, I'm sure you're thinking, well, all these challenges that disruptors face, it's amazing that anything actually changes. And in some sense, yes, it is absolutely amazing that anything does change in our industry. And I think there's a presentation I listened to not long ago at the Iowa chapter conference. They had a virtual conference with Beyond Clean, and there was a presentation about overcoming that this is how we've always done it mindset. And I think it was a fascinating one because it's really easy to say this is how we've always done it and just be okay with that without the understanding. And hopefully this presentation kind of opens some of your minds to the fact that yes, change is hard, but sometimes change can be just what you need to be able to do your job more efficiently or more effectively. And you didn't know it until you just said, okay, yes, let's give it a shot. So let's take a moment to look at some successful challenges to the status quo by industry disruptors. And this part of the presentation is so fun because we actually get to take a hard look at examples of how manufacturers have changed how we've always done it. Keep in mind that the status quo isn't always a bad thing. So I want to be very clear about that. Sometimes the way we do things is the way we do things because it's the safe way to do things. It's the appropriate way to do things, but that's not applicable to everything that we do as a department or as an industry. At one time, though, the thing we're doing right now was the disruption. And that change was made for a good reason. So just keep that in mind too. So even though the status quo for some things is necessary, at one point, the status quo that we're experiencing now was a disruption to how it was. We should never accept change for change's sake. Just because something is new doesn't mean that that thing is always better. So what makes a successful challenge to the status quo? Well, it will require all three of these things. Change is not achieved if nobody in sterile processing is actively using the change. So your department has to adopt a new technology or product and actually say yes to it and believe in it in order for a change to happen. Change can't be achieved if regulatory or accreditation organizations look at the science, look at the data and say, nope, this isn't acceptable. Again, that's not something that will allow change to happen in the industry. And if a company disappears because it goes out of business because nobody bought the product, then obviously that change can't be maintained. So you have to have all three of these things. You have to have a company that maintains their market share. You have to have regulatory and accreditation organizations that acknowledge and accept a change. And you have to have a sterile processing department that adopts the new technology and says, yes, okay, let's learn how we can implement this change in an effective way for our department. Successful change to the status quo in sterile processing is going to require a couple things. It's going to require thorough understanding of the new product or technology from all stakeholders and all surgical customers. So everyone who is affected by a change in process or a change in product has to have a thorough understanding of the technical side of those things. You have to have buy-in from key decision makers and administrative support of the change. Obviously, otherwise you're not going to get the approval, you're not going to get the funds, you're not going to get what you need to get that new product or to change the new process. You have to have adequate pre-implementation training and competency documentation. This part I think gets missed a lot, is the time necessary before a new product comes into your department to learn about it as a department, instead of once it's there, scrambling to figure out, okay, what do we do with this? Taking the time to educate and train on a new product before it gets implemented, before it even, gets put in place in your department is a really big piece to the buy-in conversation of your staff members. Remember, big changes usually result in big pushback. So if that process of getting people used to what's about to change, used to how it's going to affect things happens before the change happens, that's going to affect that adoption process in a very positive way. And then updating any pertinent policies and procedures. A lot of times changes happen quickly and we just forget to update policies and procedures. If that's the case, if any new leaders come on board or any new staff members come on board and they reference those policies and procedures that don't account for any change that has happened, it's hard to maintain any change. Okay, it might be easy to fall into what we used to do. Buy-in is, I'm going to go back to the buy-in conversation. Internal advocates and educators for why this change is necessary and why the solution you're proposing is the right choice is super important. I don't know how many of you have the users in your department, the technicians in your department, who typically have a very prominent opinion about every change that happens. Those are the users that you will want to bring into the process to train, maybe have them help train on a new process or a new product. Get their buy-in first. We'll call those the super users. Get those super users to buy in first, because if you can influence their opinion in a positive way, they will then spread that across the department for you and kind of lighten the load for you as a new product or new process advocate. You'll have support in that process. So consider those people to be your friend in this process, okay, instead of your foe. All right, let's see. So let's talk about some case studies. It might be helpful to consider a couple case studies for sterile processing disruption and really just put this into perspective in real time. Like, what are some real things that have changed and disrupted the industry for the better? First off, let's consider the disruption to sterilization parameters. Let's say that there's a new or different sterilization parameter that's introduced alongside a new product, okay? This is going to cause a lot of confusion among particularly accreditation surveyors because they have a very rigid system in mind for how things should be. Despite the difficulty with accreditation surveyors, this product may see really quick adoption among sterile processing and OR users because it makes your workflow easier, it makes your work faster. But because that rapid adoption happened, it's going to lead to some inconsistencies in policy and procedure updates. So this goes back to making sure to update policies and procedures so that changes can be maintained. The disruption has to be paired with ongoing education, not only for frontline users, but most importantly, those super users, but also for accreditation surveyors. How many of you, and I wish I could see any hand raises or nods or anything like that, but I can't right now. How many of you have ever had to have an important conversation with one of your surveyors and saying, no, actually, this is how we do it, this is how it's documented, and sort of have the discussion, I'll not say argument, we'll call it a discussion, but go that back and forth with the surveyor to prove why you do something a little bit differently than what they're expecting you to do. I've heard more and more stories about that being, carrying out in a successful way because of the documentation, because of the policies and procedures being updated. And this goes back to that ever important feedback loop that we discussed earlier. You as a user are advocating to the surveyors about a new process or about a new product, and then they're going to take that back and potentially spread that information to their surveying colleagues and saying, hey, this is a new way that people are doing this. Let's figure out if the standards are in line, or let's figure out if it's more widespread than this one department. So department leaders and department staff, being sure of your processes and being confident in those processes and actually exuding confidence when talking to surveyors is a really important characteristic to have, to just stick up for yourself and obviously have the documentation to back what you're doing. Another example involves a containment device. So let's use, for example, a new multi-tray sterilization device that's introduced as a means for bulk sterilization. I don't know if you've seen these before, but they're those big, giant stainless steel containers that you put open trays in, you seal the whole thing, and all those trays get sterilized in the same multi-sterilization container unit. There are a couple of manufacturers on the market right now. This causes quite a bit of workflow change for sterile processing in the OR and requires a lot of training for both the end users in sterile processing and the folks in the operating room as well. It may even require some modification to the sterilizer. It may have some storage implications for both sterile processing and the OR. So again, in order for this disruption to be successful, it has to require a lot of process changes and an understanding that process changes are going to be critical for the implementation and adoption of this new multi-sterilization product. And then a third case study I'd like to discuss is the quality testing protocols for endoscopes. New products for testing and swabbing of flexible endoscopes to measure residual protein and bacteria have become available in the last couple of years. And this gives endotechnicians the ability to quickly verify cleanliness. So training obviously will be required for testing and for compliant documentation. Industry guidelines will have to be updated to recommend such testing. Okay, so again, this is an opportunity for standards to catch up to innovation. Now that this residual protein and bacteria swabbing is becoming more and more commonplace, now standards have to catch up to that and actually account for the fact that, okay, we see that this is making a positive impact in the way that we can serve our patients, in the way that we can ensure cleanliness of our devices. It's important that we actually speak to it in the recommendations. Regulatory agencies will then begin to survey with the expectation that this is being done. So what a process, right? All of a sudden, this innovative product or this innovative process happens. It provides many benefits for the end users. If training is done properly, and documentation is done properly, then the surveyors can see that it's a process that makes a lot of sense, makes workflow easier, it, adds safety measures, mitigates risk, et cetera, and then the standards can follow that. So this disruption depends on the guidelines driving this adoption in order for it to be maintained. So kind of a fun example. So I love the title of this slide. Should you plan for industry disruption? A better question is, how should you plan for industry disruption? Because it's going to change. Disruption is a foregone conclusion. It will happen sooner or later. So failing to plan for it in your sterile processing department is essentially planning to fail. You can walk into a sterile processing department that hasn't changed anything in 10 years. What do you think your reaction would be to that? You'd probably think to yourself, wow, these people really need to get with the times. The process of moving from the way things were to the way things will be it's just such an ongoing process. And we have to plan for that, or else we'll just fall behind as a department. This isn't just about trying to keep up for the sake of keeping up. These changes are happening in our industry because they're better for us. They're better for our workflows, they're better for the hospital, and most importantly, they're better for our patients. Think all the way back to the beginning when I mentioned that first lap Coley procedure was done just in 1985, not that long ago. You know what's funny, when I just said that out loud, one of my friend's kids just said to me as a retort, well, you were born in the 1900s. It's like, nothing has made me feel more old than someone telling me that I was born in the 1900s. So if anyone else is out there born in the 1900s, we're in this together. Anyways, side note. But that first lap Coley procedure was done in 1985, and now that's pretty much the only way that procedure is performed. And why is that? Well, there's faster recovery time, it has a lower chance of infection, it has a lower chance of other complications. It gets people back to their lives more quickly. And if we fail to change, we're doing things the old way that can have a negative impact on patients. Imagine if you went to a surgeon when you needed your gallbladder taken out and she said, listen, I know there's this thing called laparoscopic surgery. I just don't feel like doing it because that requires me to change. What would your response probably be? I would say get a different surgeon, because if you can't keep up with positive change, you're really going to be hurting the patients overall. So how can you keep up with this rapid change? This rapid change that's happening in our industry all the time? Well, it's important to keep tabs on the innovators in our industry. Do that through social media. If you don't have a LinkedIn presence, or if you're not on LinkedIn very often, a lot of these disruptive companies are taking such a cool new approach to their social media presence, and not just putting out product information. It's not just an ad every time these companies post. It's actual education. It's actual information that's going to change how you do things and cause you to critically think about the products and processes that you have in your department. And I think that's so cool that these smaller innovative companies are taking that approach. Social media is where the most rapid information distribution happens. So you'll want to network with manufacturers, you want to network with other end users, because you can have really fruitful conversations about new technology that comes onto the market. A lot of times these new companies will engage in user workshops or focus groups. And the engineers at these companies will typically leap at the opportunity to interact with frontline users and talk about their pain points. What are your ideas for improving this product? What's working? What's not? What do you love about it? What do you hate about it? Just so that they can get a better idea as an engineer on how they can make some tweaks to it and develop an even better product. Regulatory review and update of your policies and procedures. It's not a fun process to do that, to audit your policies and procedures. Ugh, that's paperwork, right? But that will, making sure that you regularly review and update these documents will ensure that new products and processes will benefit and continue to benefit your team and your facility. And then always remember, guidelines and regulatory often lag behind the speed of innovation. So if you see a new product or you hear of a new process and you're like, well, the standards don't say anything about this, that doesn't mean that it's not in line with best practice. So definitely something to keep in mind when you see these new innovations come online. So let's recap. Disruption is a process whereby a smaller organization or company with fewer resources is able to successfully challenge established incumbent businesses. So think of those companies that have been around for as long as you've been in the industry. And then think of those other companies that have come about in the last like 5, 7, 10 years. Now you know all the work that they had to go through to get their market share that they have today. Despite all the challenges that they were up against, they're still successful because the product works. And that's a really significant piece of the puzzle, is that their product actually works. It's a process. It can be long, it can be difficult, it can be messy for not only the manufacturers, excuse me one second, not only the manufacturers, but it can be a long, difficult, messy process to implement new technology from a sterile processing perspective. And again, it comes back to that pre-implementation training and competency, and getting your super users, the ones who have the big opinions about everything, getting them on board first will help you in the long run too. It involves resources, oftentimes having to develop new resources, and successfully challenges and changes the industry. So that's industry disruption in a nutshell. It's anything that successfully challenges and changes the industry. And in the context of sterile processing, disruption impacts the current ways of doing our jobs or the current products and solutions that we may be using. I'll leave you with this. The impact of industry disruption on your sterile processing department is honestly up to you. In fact, it could be you who does the disrupting with your own innovations or your own improvements. And in the end, if a change or disruption will lead to increased patient safety or better patient outcomes, it's well worth the work. It's well worth the time. It's well worth the resources. It's worth the work to advocate for that disruption. You all do such important work. And I know that one of the hardest things to do among it all is take the things that are changing constantly and just go with those changes. But if it's a good change, and it's implemented properly, it will positively affect the way that you do your job and the way you serve your patients. Thank you for what you do. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, so spending my day with you has been it's been an honor. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for joining us this morning here on Valentine's Day weekend. It has been a pleasure to have you as always. We will be sending out a link to all of our participants from this morning, and they would be able to get their certification, their CE right away. So if you want to go ahead and give us a email, I do have a list of everybody who came. I will be sending out that email to you with the link so that you can answer a few short questions and then you can get your certificate right away.
And Leslie, I'll send you a copy of my slides. So if anyone wants to reference the slides, they can do so.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thanks,
and then we're going to go
everybody.
ahead. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get started with our chapter meeting. So you would please close out of your webinar and you would go into the Zoom link for our chapter meeting, and we'll be seeing you again shortly. Thank you.